This video is brought to you by War Thunder. Here are more extreme revenge stories from history. Number 1. Pierre Pico. If you had unlimited money, how far would you go to get revenge on friends who betrayed you? It's the turn of the 19th century in Napoleonic France, and for 25-year-old shoemaker Pierre Pico, life's going great. Though he isn't rich, he's in love with a beautiful woman named Marguerite Vigoureux, and surprisingly, she loves him too. After dating for a while, Pierre finds out that Marguerite is actually from a noble family and is very wealthy. Didn't really matter to Pierre, but what a bonus! He asks Marguerite to marry him and she says yes. Overwhelmed with joy, he rushes to tell his friends, Lupin, Solari, and Schubert, and invites them all to his wedding. Now, you would expect friends to be happy if one of their buddies was about to marry a girl who was not only beautiful, but also rich. But Pierre's friends were also poor, and instead of being happy for him, they got insanely jealous instead. Lupin in particular feels Pierre does not deserve this kind of luck, and he comes up with a prank to tell the police that Pierre is a British spy. He kinda expects it to be not that big a deal, but remember, this is Napoleonic France, and they're at war with Britain, so this is actually a pretty serious accusation. And the police, well, they take it seriously. In the middle of the night on the eve of his wedding, Pierre is arrested and thrown into Fenestrelle Fortress. Turns out a testimony from 3 close friends was all the evidence that was needed to lock him up. He gets no trial and nobody's told where he is or what happened to him. As far as everyone knows, Pierre simply vanished in the night. On their wedding day, Marguerite is left standing at the altar. She's destroyed and mourns for Pierre for 2 years, but eventually she moves on and marries Lupin, Pierre's one-time friend who got him thrown in prison in the first place. Back in the dungeon at Fenestrelle, Pierre has absolutely no idea why he's there. After 2 years with no contact with anyone other than prison guards, he scrapes a hole through his prison wall and finds an elderly man on the other side. This man is an Italian priest named Father Torri, and the two become friends. Years go by, and after gaining his trust, Father Torri tells Pierre that he's wealthy and has a hidden fortune in Milan. A few more years pass, and Father Torri has become frail and is nearing death. Pierre is heartbroken as he's about to lose his only friend, but before he passes, Father Torri gives Pierre a map to his treasure. Father Torri dies in prison, and coincidentally, the very same year, Napoleon is sent into exile. With Napoleon gone, all of his prisoners are set free, including Pierre, who steps out into the light of day for the first time in 7 years. The time in the dungeon has been rough, and he's completely unrecognizable compared to the young man he once was. His face, body, and walk are all broken from years in prison. At first glance, he now appears to be closer to 50 than a man in his 30s. Pierre travels to Milan and finds Father Torri's treasure. His dear friend was not lying, and he's now made him rich beyond belief. He travels back to France with his wealth and a new name and runs into a friend named Antoine Alou, who, by the way, did not recognize Pierre at all. Pierre offers Alou a diamond in exchange for information about what happened to a man named Pierre Pico, and he tells him the story of the prank by his 3 friends and about Lupin's marriage to Marguerite. Pierre gives Alou the diamond and walks away furious. 7 years of suffering, the loss of the love of his life, all caused by men he had once considered to be his best friends. Now, with infinite resources and nothing but time, Pierre begins to plot his revenge against the men who had destroyed his life. But before we see just how extreme Pierre got with his revenge on Lupin, let's take some time to talk about today's sponsor, War Thunder. War Thunder is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made, ever, and it's free to play on PC and console. In War Thunder, you can take command of over 2,500 tanks, planes, helicopters, and ships from 10 of the most powerful militaries in history and go up against a worldwide community of over 70 million players in epic PvP battles. Want to fly a helicopter and blow up stuff? You got it! Dogfight in a fighter jet? Yup! Trample a field of flowers in a tank? Of course! Sink battleships in a serene lake? What do you think? And with War Thunder's incredible graphics and authentic sound effects, it'll feel like you're right there. Even better, you'll be able to customize your vehicles with unique camouflage and decorations, so your opponents will know they just got owned by the bougiest tank in the game. But that's not all. One of War Thunder's coolest features is each vehicle has been modeled down to its components, which makes taking damage in the game so much more realistic. Each component can be damaged or disabled by enemy fire, and in X-ray view, you'll be able to see exactly what happened when you hit someone. No cheap hitbox snipes here. And with game modes ranging from arcade mode to simulation, you're sure to find the perfect way to play. Play War Thunder for free on PC, PlayStation, or Xbox by clicking the link in the description below. New players, or players who haven't played in a while, you'll get a massive bonus pack that includes multiple premium vehicles and the exclusive Eagle of Valor vehicle decorator. 100,000 silver lions, and 7 days of premium account benefits. This is only available for a limited time, so don't miss out. Okay, back to the revenge. While Pierre was gone, Lupion had used some of his newfound wealth from his marriage to Marguerite to open a cafe in Paris. When he found out about this, Pierre, again completely unrecognizable to anyone who knew him before, applies to work at the cafe as a waiter. He's a hard worker and quickly gains Lupion's trust. While on a shift serving food and drinks, he sees his old friends have all stayed in touch, and Solari and Chaubert frequently come in to hang out with Lupion. He had found all of his targets, and now his revenge tour could finally begin. A few weeks after Pierre begins working at Lupion's cafe, Chaubert's body is found dead in an alley, stabbed with a knife with a handle engraved with the number 1. A few days later, while walking home after eating at Lupion's cafe, Solari falls and starts foaming at the mouth. His doctor examines him and informs him he's been poisoned. He dies the next day. At the viewing of his body, a note with the number 2 is found pinned to Solari's chest. Lupion is freaked out by the sudden deaths of his 2 close friends, but hey, at least his new waiter is doing a good job. Bonjour! You f***ing prick. So Pierre's revenge admittedly has been pretty vanilla so far, but this is where it starts to get wild, because Lupion was the one who came up with the idea that got Pierre thrown in prison in the first place. Plus, he married his girl when he was gone. For this friend, a simple death would just not do. Lupion needs to suffer. Lupion has 2 adult children from a previous marriage, and this is where Pierre chooses to begin his revenge. Lupion's daughter is courted by a noble, and they fall in love. They plan an extravagant wedding with 150 esteemed guests. During the wedding dinner, the groom is running a little late, and a note is placed in front of each guest. Upon reading the note, the dinner guests discover that the groom is in fact not a noble and is actually a criminal that is again on the run. It turns out Pierre had paid this man a large sum to seduce Lupion's daughter and ruin her wedding. Lupion and his family are humiliated, and the daughter dies from shock a week later. Next, Lupion's son is arrested for participating in a robbery while drunk and sentenced to 20 years in prison. The son objects, saying he did nothing wrong, but the evidence is there. Evidence that was planted by Pierre. During sentencing, the police report anonymous bribes pushing for the death penalty. On top of all of this, while away at the wedding, Lupion's cafe is set on fire and he loses everything. Marguerite dies due to the stress of all the misfortune that seems to be coming their way, and Lupion is left homeless, penniless, and all alone. With his friend's entire life now completely destroyed, Pierre finally reveals to Lupion that he was in fact not a 50-year-old waiter, but a once former friend whom he had betrayed. Pierre stabs Lupion in the heart with a knife engraved with the number 3, killing him instantly. Had that been the end of it, we probably would never know about this story, but Alout catches Pierre in the act and holds him hostage. Alout heard Pierre's confession and tries to extort him for his fortune, but with his revenge now complete, Pierre does not care and is content to die. In frustration, Alout beats Pierre and runs away to England, where he tells others of this story on his deathbed years later. Days later, the police find Pierre starving and beaten, and he tells them the same story of his grand revenge before passing away from his injuries. Number 2. Vlad the Impaler and the Boyars. So you may have heard about this guy Vlad Dracula before, who was the inspiration for the more famous vampire of the same name. And you may have also heard of his nickname, Vlad the Impaler. But do you know how he got his nickname? It's pretty brutal, so buckle up. In the 15th century, an area called Wallachia is sandwiched between the Kingdom of Hungary to its north and the Ottoman Empire to its south. Wallachia is ruled by a man named Vlad II, and he's in a tough spot. See, Hungary and the Ottoman Empire hated each other, and they both wanted to control Wallachia. So Vlad II is caught in the middle, and he knows that if he shows too much loyalty to one side, the other will get pissed and try to invade his territory. He sends 2 of his sons to the Ottoman Empire as hostages, as a way to show them that he won't side with the Hungarians. This might have all worked, but a group of nobles called the Boyars are tired of Vlad II. They've gained a lot of wealth and power through the instability of Wallachia, and this stability is hurting their bottom line. So in 1447, they decide to work with the new ruler of Hungary, a man named John Hunyadi, to overthrow Vlad II. The Boyars kill Vlad II and capture his oldest son Mircea. They blind Mircea with red-hot iron stakes and then bury him alive. John Hunyadi and the Boyars instill a new ruler over Wallachia, a guy named Vladislav II, and word gets back to Vlad II's sons in the Ottoman Empire. One of Vlad's sons, named Vlad III? Did they not have any other names back then? You know what, let's just call him Vlad Dracula to keep things less confusing. Anyways, Dracula gets word of this and is enraged. He heads back to Wallachia to avenge his father and regain his throne. With Wallachia now secured, John Hunyadi and Vladislav go off to fight the Ottoman Empire. And while they're gone, Vlad Dracula and his men try to retake his father's throne. Turns out it was a little more complicated than just walking in unannounced when the new ruler was away. Within 2 months, John Hunyadi and Vladislav return to Wallachia to kick Vlad Dracula out again. He spends the next 8 years wandering between different regions trying to build support to regain the throne. During those 8 years, the boyars begin to sour on their new guy Vladislav because it turns out he's less corrupt than they thought. This leads to the new king of Hungary working with Vlad Dracula to unseat him. Some sources say that Dracula challenges Vladislav to a duel and kills him with his father's sword to retake the throne. But in any event, Dracula is back as ruler of Wallachia. He sends some of his men out to find the body of his brother. They find his grave and dig him up and report back to Dracula of the horrific burn marks on his skull near his eyes. The stories of what the boyars had done to his family were true, and Dracula decides that they must pay. Meanwhile, the boyars were glad that Vladislav was now gone. Back to business as usual. But this Vlad Dracula guy, he might not be too fond of them, after all the killing his dad and brother stuff. They debate whether or not to assassinate him, but on Easter Sunday in 1457, Dracula invites the boyars to a feast to celebrate the holy holiday. They arrive thinking everything's cool now. They're dressed in their best clothing and bring their wives and children to Vlad's castle. The feast is laid out and it is amazing. Vlad Dracula wines and dines them and they all eat until they're stuffed. At the end of the meal, Vlad stands and asks the boyars, "How many rulers have you seen in your lifetime?" The boyars, feeling very comfortable, begin to laugh. 10, some say. Some say 20. The oldest of them say 30. Even the kids chime in and say they've seen at least 7 different rulers. The smile on Dracula's face slowly turns into a scowl. He then asks the boyars, how is it possible to have so many different rulers, yet the boyars are still the same? Immediately, the dining hall is swarmed with Dracula's men. They grab the boyars and lead them outside. As the nobles exit the castle, they're horrified to see a line of pointed wooden stakes protruding from the ground. The oldest of the boyars are lifted up by Dracula's men and placed butt first onto the sharp stakes. Their families can do nothing but watch in horror as the men thrash and scream in agony. The lucky die instantly as gravity pulls their bodies towards the ground. The unlucky survive for days, impaled with their feet dangling in the air. The wives and children are then forced to march for 2 days without food or water to a cliffside where they find nothing but a mountain of bricks. They're told to carry the bricks to the top of the cliff and build Dracula's new castle. With no choice, the wives and children work on the castle until they die of starvation or their bodies break down from the intense labor and they fall off the cliff. The castle, called Poianati, was the inspiration for the home of the fictional vampire Dracula, and its ruins can still be visited in Romania today. Number 3. Basil II and Tsar Samuel. Sometimes revenge is born from loyalty and honor, like in the last story, but sometimes it's simply a giant middle finger to someone who's made your life miserable for a long time. And in this case, it was one gruesome middle finger. Basil II became the sole emperor of the Byzantine Empire at the young age of 18, and almost immediately was forced to deal with all kinds of bullshit. Many people within and around the empire saw a young and inexperienced ruler and thought, hey, now might be a great time for a good old-fashioned uprising. And rise up they did. First, Basil was forced to deal with 2 aristocrats who had quietly amassed armies within his empire. Surprising many of his haters, the young emperor put down this rebellion and stabilized his country for the first time in years. But the conflict inside his empire was only the start of his long list of issues. There were also many groups outside of the empire who were just as excited to test the young emperor and try to take a piece of Byzantine for themselves. And that brings us to the subject of this story, in what is probably one of the most savage acts of revenge in human history, and the reason Basil II earned his metal nickname, the Bulgar Slayer. While Basil was busy sending his own citizens into permanent timeouts for their rebellions, a man who eventually became known as Tsar Samuel was busy rebuilding the Bulgarian Empire in the Balkans. The Bulgarians under Samuel began taking Byzantine land, and Basil finally had time to deal with this troublemaker. Over the next few decades, through many battles, Basil and Samuel developed a deep hatred for one another, and the heat only got hotter after the Bulgarians killed one of Samuel's favorite generals, Botaniates. Things were now personal for Basil, and on July 29, 1014, in the Battle of Claydon, Basil finally got the revenge he was looking for. Basil soundly defeated Samuel and captured 15,000 of his men. Fueled by rage over the death of his friend Botaniates, Basil comes up with a gruesome punishment that would inflict maximum pain and suffering on his rival. First, Basil divided the prisoners into groups of 100 men. Next, he ordered his men to blind 99 of the men in these groups using knives or burning hot metal rods. One by one, Basil's soldiers perform this horrific procedure on their prisoners, and when they get to the last man in each group, they leave him with one eye. Basil then sets them free and tells them to go back home. The blinded men, now completely dependent on the 150 spared with one eye, wander together in darkness and agony back to their homeland, unable to ever fight again, and destined to become burdens on Samuel's society. When he sees his men arrive home, Tsar Samuel is so horrified that he suffers a heart attack and passes away 2 days later. Number 4. Crum and Nikephoros I. So we're going to stick in the same area as the last story, but just roll back the clock a few centuries. Now that I think about it, maybe that last story is a sort of revenge for this story? Anyways, let's just get into it. It's the turn of the 9th century and Bulgaria is under the rule of a Khan named Crum. Through his efforts, Bulgaria has expanded its territory and is now a rival in terms of military power to its neighbor, the once invincible Eastern Roman Empire. The Romans at this time had lost a bunch of territory and were also suffering from a lot of internal religious conflicts. Seeing this from the outside, the Bulgars were starting to test the borders between the two states, just, to see how strong the Romans really were. The emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, Nikephoros I, did not like this, and he was determined to show the world that the Romans had not fallen off. He spends a year building an army and decides to invade Bulgaria to prove it, and in 811, his campaign against Crum begins. Nikephoros and his army of around 20,000 men march into Bulgaria, and initially, Crum does not want to fight. He tries to sue for peace, but Nikephoros, taking this as a sign of weakness, refuses and marches to Pliska, the capital of Bulgaria. He fights Crum and his men for the first time there, and it's an easy victory. The Bulgars are forced to retreat, and they abandon Pliska. Nikephoros and his men pillage the city. They kill many citizens and take even more as slaves. They even steal treasure from Crum's palace before setting the whole city on fire. With this easy win, Nikephoros feels like he just cemented his GOAT status amongst Roman emperors. Crum sends more messengers to Nikephoros trying to negotiate a peace deal, but the Roman emperor doesn't want to hear any of it. In his mind, he's already dominated Crum, and now he thinks he can conquer all of Bulgaria. Instead of heading back to Constantinople, Nikephoros stays with his men in Bulgaria and allows them to go out and start looting more towns and villages. Crum, now rejected twice when he offered a peace, decided that the Romans would need to learn not to with the Bulgarians the hard way. He rounds up his remaining men and takes them behind Nikephoros and the pillaging Romans. Instead of engaging them head-on, he begins to secretly block off all the mountain passes they would need to return home to Constantinople. They then set a trap for the Romans in the Barbitsa Pass, which was the shortest route the Romans could take to get home. After a few months and no signs of Crum, Nikephoros decides his men have had enough and begins making the journey home through the Barbitsa Pass. Due to the narrowness of the trail, his men are stretched out for miles. At the end of the formation, the men cannot see what's happening at the front. Deep in the pass, the Romans find their path is blocked, and as they look up, they're shocked to find Crum and his men surrounding them from the high ground. As night falls, the Romans set up camp and Crum and the Bulgars taunt them throughout the night. The taunting goes on for days, and the Romans are losing morale as they begin to feel more like prey than predators. Then, on July 26, 811, Crum leads a charge, and the Bulgarians begin slaughtering the Roman soldiers. Crum and his men go after Nikephoros and kill him. Seeing this, the rest of the Roman soldiers begin running in all directions. Many flee south and try to cross a river, but their heavy armor sinks them into the mud, drowning them as more soldiers trample over them in a panic. By the end of the day, nearly the entire Roman army is dead. The few that survive are all badly wounded, including Nikephoros' son, who's now paralyzed from the neck down. Crum orders his men to remove Nikephoros' head. He brings it home and boils it to remove its flesh, leaving just his skull. He then turns the skull into a decorative cup and coats it with silver. He then uses this skull to toast his men for their victory over the mighty Eastern Roman Empire, and in future meetings with Roman diplomats, he would force them to drink from this skull cup when they arrived. Metal! Thanks again to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Play it for free on PC, PlayStation, or Xbox, and don't forget to click the link in the description below to get a massive bonus pack of awesome stuff. Anyways, if you like these revenge stories, you should check out this video too.